History, as we know it, is often a carefully curated narrative passed down through generations. It's a collection of triumphs, struggles, and key moments that shape the world, but not all of it is based on fact. In fact, some of the most persistent historical facts are pure fabrications, grand myths that have been passed down for centuries, warped, exaggerated, and twisted to fit a narrative that serves a purpose, often cultural, political, or commercial. These myths, though entertaining and fascinating, mislead us into thinking we understand history better than we actually do. What if I told you that many of the stories we've been taught, the ones that seem so iconic and believable, are actually little more than historical fan fiction? From royal PR stunts to widespread tales that went viral long before the internet existed, these myths have been repeated so often they've become truths in the eyes of many. Today, we're going to unravel 33 of the most enduring, odd, and persistent historical myths. These are the tales that have become larger than life, ones that we all thought we knew, but in reality are entirely untrue or vastly distorted. Let's start with one of the most famous and enduring myths, the Great Wall of China. You've probably heard it countless times. It's the only man-made structure visible from space. It's an epic thought, a testament to human achievement. Right? Well, here's the truth. You can't see the Great Wall from space, not even from low Earth orbit with the naked eye. Astronauts have debunked this myth on multiple occasions, saying it's about as visible as a major highway from orbit. In fact, the wall, at its widest point, is only about 20 feet across, so the idea of spotting it from space is a fantasy. How did this myth even begin? It seems to have originated long before space exploration, probably due to its colossal length and the romanticized perception of the wall as a monumental achievement. The myth stuck because it's just too grand to check. A perfect PR story that got passed along, much like gossip in a game of telephone, until it became accepted as fact. The reality is far less spectacular, but no less important. The Great Wall is still a testament to the human drive for survival and defense, even if it doesn't quite live up to its celestial reputation. This myth about the Great Wall serves as a metaphor for how easily false facts can become entrenched in our culture. It's a reminder that history, much like the human imagination, is often distorted by the power of storytelling. And it's not just the Great Wall we've gotten wrong. There are many more myths that have quietly snuck their way into our understanding of the past. Now, let's dive into some of these fables, some so persistent that they've been accepted as gospel by generations of people. The myth of the Great Wall being visible from space is one of those misconceptions that feels almost too grand to question. After all, we've heard it repeated by teachers, movies, and even popular science shows. The idea of a monumental structure that can be seen from the vast expanse of space fits neatly into the human desire for something to be not just big, but spectacular. Something that transcends the earthly, placing it in the realm of the otherworldly. The thought that we built something so colossal it can be seen from the stars is undeniably alluring. But here's the catch: it's simply not true. Astronauts who have ventured into space, those who have seen the Earth from above, have all said the same thing. The Great Wall is not visible to the naked eye, not even close. In fact, the myth likely started long before the first astronaut looked down on Earth. The wall is incredibly long, stretching over 13,000 miles, but it's only about 20 feet wide at its widest point, making it about as visible from space as a single hair lying on the ground from 2 meters away. Despite its impressive length, it's just too narrow and earth-toned to stand out in the vastness of the planet's surface. This myth is a curious blend of human imagination and historical pride. The Great Wall, though, is still an awe-inspiring feat of engineering. Built over several centuries, it was originally constructed to protect China from invading forces from the north, and its significance as a cultural symbol is undeniable. However, its practical visibility from space, a narrative invention. What's fascinating is how this myth perpetuated itself, not due to scientific ignorance, but because it fits so perfectly into the mythic role we've assigned to the wall in our collective imagination. What's also intriguing is that this myth survived because it was simply too compelling to fact-check. Before we had the technology or the perspective to prove it wrong, this story sounded so good that it became part of the historical lore surrounding the Great Wall. It's a bit like a historical fairy tale, a simple narrative that people didn't feel the need to question, because the grandeur of the idea itself was enough to make it feel like a universal truth. So, where does that leave us? What do we take away from this? The Great Wall of China may not be visible from space, but it remains an incredible symbol of human determination. Its mythic status in popular culture, however, shows just how powerful stories can be. They shape how we view history, even when those stories are more fantasy than fact. But this isn't the only myth we've collectively clung to. In fact, many others persist with just as much tenacity. Consider the legend of the sewer alligators of New York City, an equally absurd myth, but one that has persisted for generations. Let's look at how this particular tale of urban wildlife became as well known as the Great Wall itself. The story is a classic piece of urban folklore that continues to pop up in conversations and media. The sewer alligators of New York City. This tale goes something like this. Rich families, having bought baby alligators as pets, grew tired of them as the reptiles grew too large and flushed them down the toilet. These resilient creatures, having survived the harsh conditions of the sewers, supposedly grew into giant, blind, albino monsters, living in the dark, damp labyrinths beneath the city, occasionally emerging to strike terror in the hearts of unsuspecting New Yorkers. It's a fantastic, movie-worthy horror plot, and like many such stories, it has absolutely no basis in reality. Despite decades of sanitation workers navigating the miles of underground tunnels and sewers beneath New York, there has never been any confirmed discovery of a colony of giant alligators living in the depths. What's more, the conditions in the sewers would make it almost impossible for alligators to survive for long, let alone thrive. They would need a source of food, which the sewers, despite their urban abundance, simply couldn't provide in the quantities required for such creatures to grow into the monsters described in the legend. So, where did this bizarre story come from? It seems to have originated in the 1930s, a period when exotic pets, including alligators, were somewhat trendy among wealthy New Yorkers. The idea that people might flush these pets down the toilet wasn't entirely outlandish, especially when the city's vast, subterranean world remained largely a mystery to the average citizen. But the myth didn't stop there. It gained momentum with media stories in the 1930s and 1940s, including news reports about alligators being found in the city's sewer system. Though, Upon further investigation, these were typically small alligators abandoned by owners, not the mythical giants of urban legend. This myth has persisted for decades, largely because it taps into something primal, the fear of the unknown, the dark, and the hidden spaces beneath our feet. It's easy to imagine terrifying creatures lurking just out of sight in a vast and unfamiliar underground world. The fact that the myth involves not just any animal, but a dangerous predator, an alligator, adds an element of excitement, making it all the more intriguing. The enduring popularity of the sewer alligator myth is a testament to how folklore can be shaped by fear and the unknown. It also speaks to the power of sensationalism. Even when the truth is readily available, New York City's sewers are meticulously mapped, and wildlife experts have consistently debunked the myth. People continue to tell the story. It's more fun, more captivating to imagine giant albino alligators terrorizing the dark underbelly of the city than to accept the mundane reality that no such creatures exist. The sewer alligator myth isn't just a piece of urban fantasy. It's a snapshot of how myths take hold in society, thriving on mystery and the human tendency to sensationalize the unknown. But this myth, like so many others, is rooted in a deep-seated human fascination with the strange and the fantastical. Let's move on to another widespread myth that has sparked even more intrigue, this one involving one of the most famous secret societies in history, the Illuminati. The Illuminati, a name that's become synonymous with global conspiracies, shadowy elites controlling the world's governments, and the whispers of a powerful secret society pulling the strings behind every major event. The all-seeing eye on the dollar bill, symbols hidden in plain sight, and world leaders allegedly bound by a common agenda. The Illuminati is an idea that has gripped the imagination of millions, making its way into books, movies, and even political discourse. But here's the truth. The Illuminati was never the all-powerful cabal that modern conspiracy theories make it out to be. In fact, it was far from it. The Illuminati was a real group, founded in 1776 in Bavaria, Germany, by a man named Adam Weishaupt. The group's initial goal wasn't world domination, but rather the promotion of Enlightenment ideals, reason, secularism, and freedom from the control of religion, particularly the Catholic Church. It was essentially a small intellectual society, composed mostly of Enlightenment-era thinkers who sought to challenge the status quo. They held secret meetings, but the idea of them plotting a global takeover was never part of their agenda. The Bavarian Illuminati, as it was known, was, in reality, a short-lived group. It only lasted for about a decade before it was disbanded by the Bavarian government in 1785. The group never managed to expand beyond the borders of Germany, and even at its height, it had fewer than 2,000 members. This was hardly a global network of elites secretly controlling the world, as some modern theories suggest. Rather, it was a small group of intellectuals whose most significant achievement was inspiring fear and suspicion, which, ironically, contributed to the very myth they are tied to today. Despite its rapid demise, the Illuminati has lived on in conspiracy theories, partly due to its dramatic potential. The idea of a secret society controlling world affairs is simply too tantalizing for many to dismiss. And in the centuries since the group's dissolution, countless books, documentaries, and movies have latched onto the myth of the Illuminati, creating a far more complex and sinister narrative than the original group ever intended. The fact that it failed so spectacularly as a secret society only seems to have enhanced its allure, transforming it from an obscure footnote in history into a symbol of shadowy power. This fascination with the Illuminati speaks to our fear of power structures that are invisible and out of our control. It's easy to believe in such a group because the idea of a hidden force pulling the strings aligns with the ways we often perceive global events: complex, unfathomable, and beyond our grasp. The Illuminati, though, serves as a reminder of how easily fear, mystery, and misunderstanding can create lasting myths. But as we'll see, the Illuminati is just one example of how history can be reshaped by legend. There's another famous figure in history whose legend was spun into something far greater than reality: St. Patrick. Let's look at the story behind him and his famous snakes. St. Patrick, the legendary figure who is said to have driven all the snakes out of Ireland. It's a tale that's been told countless times, often to celebrate his miraculous feats and his role in bringing Christianity to Ireland. But here's the catch: there were never any snakes in post-glacial Ireland to begin with. The island was cut off from the rest of Europe for so long that, long before St. Patrick's time, snakes simply didn't make it there. In fact, Ireland's isolation and climate made it an unlikely home for any snakes, even if they had wanted to slither across the sea. So, how did this iconic story come to be? It's likely that the snakes St. Patrick drove out were never meant to be literal. Instead, they represented the pagan beliefs and practices that were prevalent in Ireland before the Christianization efforts led by Patrick. The snakes were a metaphorical symbol of the old gods and the religions that St. Patrick worked to replace with Christianity. Far from chasing actual reptiles off the land, St. Patrick was engaging in a spiritual battle to rid Ireland of its pagan practices. This metaphorical interpretation becomes even clearer when you consider the historical context. The Christian missionary effort in Ireland was not just about converting people to a new faith. It was about turning the page on a long-standing system of beliefs and rituals that had defined Irish life for centuries. The narrative of Patrick driving out the snakes was a brilliant piece of PR, a way to frame the spread of Christianity as a victory over the evil forces of paganism. By casting Patrick as a snake slayer, the story gave him a heroic, almost mythic status, making his mission seem far more epic and significant than it perhaps was in reality. What's remarkable about this tale is how it has endured over the centuries. The story of St. Patrick driving out the snakes became so entrenched in Irish folklore that it overshadowed the more mundane and complex aspects of his missionary work. It is the very nature of myth-making that allows us to take a historical figure and turn them into something larger than life, blending fact with legend to create a narrative that resonates with the public's imagination. In a way, this myth is also a reflection of the power of storytelling. The tale of the snakes, though inaccurate in its details, has endured because it speaks to deeper themes of triumph and purification. It's not about the literal presence of snakes, but rather about the cultural shift that took place as Christianity took hold in Ireland. Now that we've examined how a single metaphor could become a centuries-old myth, let's move on to another piece of historical truth: that's also been wildly exaggerated. The story of Absinthe, the green fairy that allegedly caused hallucinations and inspired great art. Absinthe, often referred to as the green fairy, is legendary for its supposed ability to inspire vivid hallucinations and bizarre, frenzied artistic creativity. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it became the drink of choice among poets, artists, and intellectuals. The myth surrounding absinthe is as intoxicating as the drink itself. Stories of artists like Van Gogh, Baudelaire, and Hemingway allegedly imbibing the mysterious liquor and experiencing mind-altering visions, leading to bursts of profound, sometimes manic, creativity. For years, absinthe was said to unlock the door to a mystical, hallucinatory realm. But this entire reputation is one of the most brilliant and enduring smears in alcohol history. The truth behind absinthe's supposedly mind-altering properties is far more mundane and much less exciting than the stories would have us believe. The real culprit behind its infamous effects wasn't a mystical chemical called thujone, but rather the large amounts of alcohol that the drink contained. Absinthe, in its purest form, could reach alcohol content levels of up to 70–75%, far higher than most spirits. In other words, the artists weren't seeing visions. They were simply intoxicated, drunk out of their minds. The supposed hallucinations, they were likely just the effects of heavy drinking combined with the potent, bitter flavor of the drink. So where did the myth of absinthe's hallucinogenic properties come from? It likely stems from a smear campaign launched by the French wine industry in the early 20th century, when absinthe was gaining popularity and cutting into their profits. The wine lobby, fearing the competition, spread exaggerated and often completely fabricated stories about the dangers of absinthe. They painted it as a dangerous, mind-altering drug that could drive people mad and lead to fits of violence. The truth was, the French wine industry wasn't just trying to protect its profits. It was trying to create a panic around absinthe that would justify its eventual ban in 1915. Ironically, absinthe's ban only further cemented its mystique. The myth of the green fairy and its mind-bending effects grew stronger, making the drink more desirable in the eyes of rebellious artists and intellectuals. In the public imagination, absinthe became synonymous with the bohemian lifestyle, mysterious, decadent, and dangerous. Its fame was only amplified by the very prohibition that sought to extinguish it. And while the drink is once again legal in many countries today, its reputation as a hallucinatory elixir still lingers, despite the fact that no scientific evidence has ever supported the idea that thujone in absinthe causes any psychoactive effects. Absinthe's myth is a perfect example of how fear and competition can warp the truth, creating a narrative far more exciting than the reality. It shows how easily myths can be cultivated, even in the absence of any real evidence, simply by playing on people's imaginations and desires for the exotic, the forbidden, and the extraordinary. The green fairy might not be real, but the legacy of absinthe in all its romanticized glory lives on. From mind-bending myths to stories of strange animal behavior, there are many more historical myths waiting to be uncovered. Next, let's take a look at one that's both tragic and bizarre: the tale of the mass suicide of lemmings. It's a classic, a story many people still believe today. The story of lemmings marching off a cliff, blindly committing mass suicide, is one of the most famous and enduring myths in the animal kingdom. It paints a vivid, almost tragic picture of nature's inexplicable cruelty. The image of these small, furry creatures, driven by some mysterious instinct to hurl themselves to their deaths off a cliff, has become a powerful metaphor for mindless conformity and the dangers of herd mentality. We've all heard the tale, and it has shaped our understanding of lemmings as a species, but it is utterly, completely false. This entire myth was born out of a 1958 Disney nature documentary called White Wilderness. The filmmakers, unable to capture the dramatic spectacle of mass animal suicide they were hoping for, resorted to something far more sinister. They faked it. The crew didn't simply film lemmings in their natural habitat. They bought a large number of lemmings, transported them to a cliffside, and physically pushed them off the edge. The film famously shows the lemmings plunging into the icy waters below, but the reality of how those animals ended up there is far from natural. In fact, they were coerced into death for the sake of entertainment and film awards. The myth was cemented when the documentary was released, and people around the world saw the footage of lemmings seemingly driven to suicide. The film was so convincing that the story became entrenched in popular culture, with many people accepting it as fact. But the truth is far less dramatic. Lemmings are not suicidal. They are simply a species known for their population booms and busts. When their numbers grow too large for their environment to support, they may migrate in large groups, sometimes venturing into areas they wouldn't normally go. But this migration does not involve them hurling themselves to their deaths. It's simply an instinctive attempt to find new, more sustainable territory. The lasting power of this myth speaks to something deeper within us, the allure of tragedy and the dramatic. There's something profoundly compelling about the idea of animals following each other off a cliff, symbolizing a blind, unthinking drive towards destruction. It's the kind of story that grabs the imagination, making it almost too easy to believe. In reality, it's a classic case of exploitation for the sake of a story, and it shows how easy it is for false narratives to be spread when they play on deep-seated human emotions and cultural fears. What makes the lemming myth so tragic is not just the fact that it's false, but that it was manufactured for profit and recognition. The real tragedy here isn't the lemmings. It's the way humans have used animals for their own dramatic purposes, fabricating their stories for entertainment. It's a reminder of how much control we exert over the stories we tell, even when those stories harm the truth. Having exposed the fabricated myth of lemming suicide, let's now look at a tale that revolves around something far more glamorous: diamonds. The myth of diamonds being rare and valuable has lasted for generations, but the truth behind their inflated worth is rooted in marketing genius, not scarcity. Let's delve into how the myth of the diamond was created. Diamonds, the sparkling, flawless gems that have come to symbolize wealth, love, and eternal commitment. It's the gemstone that dominates engagement rings, representing a promise that's meant to last forever. We've all heard that diamonds are incredibly rare, that they hold an intrinsic value that makes them some of the most precious objects on Earth. But the reality is far different from the glittering narrative we've been sold. Diamonds, contrary to popular belief, are not particularly rare. In fact, they are one of the most common gemstones on Earth. What makes them valuable is not their scarcity, but the way they have been marketed to the public. The diamond industry, most notably through the De Beers Company, has played an enormous role in shaping the perception of diamonds as rare, valuable, and symbolic of eternal love. In the 20th century, De Beers, with its near monopoly over the global diamond market, orchestrated one of the most successful marketing campaigns in history. It all began in the 1940s when De Beers partnered with the advertising agency N.W. Ayer to create an image of diamonds as the ultimate symbol of love and commitment. The campaign, which included the famous slogan, "A diamond is forever," made the association between diamonds and marriage seem like an age-old tradition, even though in reality it was a relatively new concept. Before this campaign, engagement rings were not a widespread tradition, and diamonds were often reserved for royalty or the very wealthy. By the time the 1950s rolled around, De Beers had successfully convinced the public that the only acceptable engagement ring was one that featured a diamond. But the marketing didn't stop at engagement rings. The campaign also created a sense of urgency around diamonds, painting them as a necessity for a lasting relationship. It wasn't just about the value of the stone itself, it was about the message it conveyed. The slogan, "A diamond is forever," didn't just sell a piece of jewelry, it sold an idea, a societal expectation. It suggested that if you truly loved someone, you would give them a diamond, an idea so compelling that it became ingrained in cultural practices around the world. So, what's the truth? The rarity of diamonds is far less significant than the value placed on them by a calculated marketing effort. Diamonds themselves are not especially rare. They are just one of many precious stones, though they are often priced as though they are the rarest. The myth of their scarcity is a carefully constructed illusion, designed to create demand and increase prices. What we perceive as the value of diamonds is, in fact, a byproduct of clever marketing and a long-standing corporate monopoly on the diamond trade. The impact of this marketing campaign has been profound. It's hard to imagine a world where diamonds aren't tied to the idea of love and commitment, but that's precisely the world we lived in before De Beers' campaign reshaped the diamond's narrative. The myth of diamonds being rare and intrinsically valuable is not based on any natural fact, but on a genius bit of advertising that tapped into societal values and desires. From marketing manipulation to the truths hidden behind myths, this is just one example of how easily we can be convinced by narratives that seem too good to be questioned. But not all myths are so carefully constructed. Some simply slip through the cracks of time and culture, like the famous line from Sherlock Holmes. Let's explore another iconic myth. Elementary, my dear Watson. When you think of Sherlock Holmes, you probably imagine him turning to his loyal companion, Dr. Watson, and saying, "Elementary, my dear Watson." It's one of the most iconic quotes in literary history, so ingrained in popular culture that it's instantly recognizable. The image of Holmes coolly explaining his brilliant deductions with this phrase has become part of his identity. But here's the surprising truth. Sherlock Holmes never actually says this line in any of the original stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Yes, you read that correctly. While Holmes does say elementary and my dear Watson in separate instances throughout the stories, The famous combination of both words into that one iconic phrase was never part of the original text. The line was popularized in the 20th century, specifically in theatrical plays and early films about the famous detective. It was in these adaptations, many of which were dramatized for entertainment, that the phrase was first used, solidifying its place in the collective imagination. The creation of this line as the ultimate Holmesian catchphrase reveals an interesting aspect of how culture shapes the legacy of literary characters. It wasn't Conan Doyle who crafted this now famous phrase, but rather the filmmakers and stage actors who, looking for a way to capture Holmes's logical brilliance in a single, memorable line, invented it. The result? A quote that, while never part of the original canon, became more famous than any of Holmes's actual dialogue. The story behind this myth is fascinating because it highlights how easily popular culture can shape and redefine iconic figures. Doyle's original Holmes is a much more complex and nuanced character whose deductions and interactions with Watson vary across the stories. The idea of a perfectly tidy, one-liner explanation didn't quite fit Doyle's vision, but in the world of cinema and theater, it was precisely the kind of dramatic flair that worked. And so, elementary, my dear Watson, became the definitive phrase for Holmes, even though it was never his. This isn't the only time a cultural adaptation has transformed a character or a moment from literature. Just like the Sherlock Holmes myth, there are countless instances where fiction, as it's interpreted by society, evolves in ways the original creators never intended. This phenomenon is a testament to the power of the public's imagination and how the lines between fact, fiction, and interpretation often blur in the world of storytelling. Now that we've debunked the Holmesian catchphrase, let's tackle another long-standing myth, this time, one that centers around the shape of our planet. Did people in the Middle Ages really believe the Earth was flat? Let's explore this common misconception and uncover the truth. One of the most enduring myths in history is the idea that people in the Middle Ages believed the Earth was flat. This belief, often referred to as the Dark Ages misconception, has become a shorthand for portraying medieval people as ignorant and superstitious. The myth paints a picture of a time when intellectuals and common folk alike feared the unknown, clinging to archaic beliefs about the world, its shape, and their place in the cosmos. But here's the truth. People in the Middle Ages did not believe the Earth was flat. In fact, the idea of a spherical Earth was well established by the time the Middle Ages rolled around. Ancient Greek philosophers, including Pythagoras, Aristotle, and Eratosthenes, had already proven the Earth was round centuries before Christ. By the 5th century AD, educated individuals across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa understood that the Earth was spherical. In fact, this knowledge was passed down through the Roman Empire, preserved by scholars, and integrated into medieval education. So where did the idea of a flat Earth in the Middle Ages come from? It was largely invented in the 19th century. During the Romantic period, there was a movement to frame the Middle Ages as a dark, ignorant time, devoid of reason or intellectual achievement. This narrative was further popularized by 19th century historians who sought to portray the Age of Enlightenment as a stark contrast to the supposed intellectual darkness of medieval Europe. In doing so, they exaggerated the ignorance of the Middle Ages, including the idea that people thought the Earth was flat. The fact that Columbus' famous voyage was framed as a battle against this supposed ignorance only helped solidify the myth. In reality, by the time Columbus set sail in 1492, the idea that the Earth was round was widely accepted by educated people. Columbus critics were not concerned about him sailing off the edge of the Earth. Their real issue was that he vastly underestimated the Earth's size and overestimated the distance to Asia. The Columbus proves the Earth is round. Myth is a distortion of history, designed to turn a story of flawed navigation into a heroic battle for knowledge. The flat Earth myth is a prime example of how history is often rewritten to fit modern narratives. By simplifying complex intellectual developments into a story of ignorance versus enlightenment, we distort the real achievements of past civilizations. In reality, the Middle Ages were not a time of mindless superstition, but a period in which much intellectual work was done, including the preservation and expansion of ancient knowledge. The persistence of this myth is a reminder of how powerful cultural narratives can be, even when they are based on false premises. It's not just the Middle Ages that has been misrepresented in this way. Throughout history, many periods have been mischaracterized for the sake of a more compelling, simplified story. Now, let's turn our attention to another myth that's deeply tied to the concept of hubris and human pride: the unsinkable Titanic. The sinking of the Titanic is often regarded as the ultimate tale of human arrogance. An unsinkable ship, deemed by its creators to be impervious to disaster, meeting its tragic end on the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The myth that Titanic was labeled unsinkable has become so ingrained in the public consciousness that it's almost impossible to think of the disaster without imagining this fateful claim being made. But here's the truth: the Titanic was never officially declared unsinkable by its creators. What the White Star Line, the company behind the Titanic, actually said was that the ship was practically unsinkable. The Titanic was built with a sophisticated design, including watertight compartments that were thought to provide the ship with unprecedented protection. However, these compartments were not fully sealed at the top, meaning that if the ship's hull were punctured, water could flow from one compartment to the next, eventually sinking the ship. This design flaw, combined with the ship's speed and the icy waters on the night of the disaster, ultimately led to its tragic fate. The unsinkable myth grew largely after the fact. Following the disaster, the media seized on the notion of the ship being unsinkable because it made for a much more compelling and dramatic narrative. Newspapers quickly picked up the phrase, and the idea of the Titanic as a symbol of human hubris became central to its story. The press sensationalized the idea of a ship so technologically advanced that it couldn't possibly sink, making the eventual tragedy even more poignant and ironic. In reality, the Titanic's builders and officers were acutely aware of the ship's vulnerability. The Titanic was, in fact, equipped with only enough lifeboats for about half of its passengers and crew, a serious oversight that contributed to the high death toll. But the myth of its unsinkability persisted because it made the tragedy more dramatic. It was no longer just the sinking of a ship. It was the fall of a symbol of modernity, the collapse of human overconfidence. The lasting power of this myth speaks to our desire for stories of dramatic irony, where the grandest aspirations are met with the most humbling consequences. The Titanic story has become so intertwined with the idea of an unsinkable ship that it's difficult to separate fact from fiction. The real tragedy, however, lies not in the ship's supposed invincibility, but in the profound consequences of human error and the limits of even the most advanced technology of its time. From unsinkable ships to mistaken identities, let's now turn our attention to a historical figure whose legacy has been similarly distorted: Cleopatra. While she is often portrayed as a seductress and the epitome of beauty, the truth about Cleopatra is far more fascinating than the myths that surround her. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, is a figure whose name is synonymous with beauty, intrigue, and political drama. Hollywood has often depicted her as a dazzling seductress, a woman whose beauty was so captivating that it could bring mighty Roman leaders to their knees. But the truth about Cleopatra is far more complex and far more interesting than the glamorous myths that surround her. First and foremost, Cleopatra was not Egyptian. While she ruled Egypt, she was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that had ruled Egypt since Alexander the Great's death. The Ptolemies, in fact, were Macedonian Greeks, and Cleopatra was a direct descendant of one of Alexander's generals. This fact often surprises people, especially given her association with Egyptian culture and her famous image as an Egyptian queen. In reality, Cleopatra was as Greek as she was Egyptian, but she cleverly embraced Egyptian customs, using them to solidify her power and connect with her subjects. Beyond her ethnicity, Cleopatra's beauty has been greatly exaggerated. While historical records describe her as charismatic and highly intelligent, there is little evidence to suggest she was a classical beauty by modern standards. Coins minted during her reign portray her with a prominent hooked nose and a strong, determined face, not the delicate features often depicted in Hollywood films. What made Cleopatra truly captivating wasn't her looks, but her remarkable intellect, political acumen, and the ability to wield her personal charm as a tool of statecraft. She was multilingual, speaking several languages, and was known for her sharp mind and strategic thinking. Cleopatra's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not merely love affairs, as often portrayed, but politically motivated alliances. These alliances were pivotal in her efforts to maintain power in a kingdom under constant threat from both internal and external forces. Cleopatra's seduction of Caesar and later her involvement with Antony were acts of political savvy, not just romantic entanglements. She understood the importance of alliances, and she used her relationships with these Roman leaders to secure her throne and Egypt's independence. In many ways, Cleopatra's life is a perfect example of how myths can distort a historical figure's true legacy. Her beauty and romantic escapades have often overshadowed her true political brilliance, turning her into a character in a love story rather than a formidable ruler. The narrative of Cleopatra as a beguiling woman who captivated powerful men clouds the complexity of her reign and the true nature of her rule. She was a strategist, a ruler who navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics and Egyptian dynastic struggles with remarkable skill. Cleopatra's story is a cautionary tale about the power of myth to reshape history. While her intelligence, political maneuvering, and leadership are often overshadowed by the sensationalized portrayal of her love affairs, The truth about Cleopatra is far more empowering. She wasn't merely a beautiful queen. She was a savvy and determined ruler who shaped the course of history. It's a reminder that history is often shaped not just by what people did, but by how their actions are remembered. With the truth about Cleopatra now revealed, let's move on to another famous myth, the tale of Isaac Newton and the falling apple. The story of Newton discovering gravity after an apple hit him on the head has become one of the most enduring scientific myths. But as you might have guessed, the truth is far less dramatic. The iconic story of Isaac Newton discovering gravity after an apple fell on his head is so widely known that it's almost become the stuff of legend. It's a neat, simple, and almost poetic narrative. Newton, sitting under a tree, struck by an apple, suddenly realizing the force of gravity and how it governs the universe. The image of the apple falling from the tree has been immortalized in countless books, cartoons, and even science classrooms. It's the perfect origin story for one of the greatest scientific minds in history. But here's the truth. It didn't happen quite like that. There's no record of an apple actually falling on Newton's head, and the story itself appears to be a later embellishment. Newton himself never mentioned the apple incident as the defining moment of his discovery. Instead, he described the moment more philosophically. According to his own account, he was sitting in his garden, looking at an apple fall from a tree, which led him to wonder why objects always fall straight down and not sideways or upward. This simple observation sparked his thinking about the force of gravity. The apple didn't hit him on the head in a dramatic eureka moment. It was more of a quiet, reflective moment that contributed to his understanding of gravitational force. The myth of the apple was popularized much later, particularly in the 18th century, after Newton's work had been widely recognized and celebrated. The image of the apple became a convenient metaphor for the sudden, inspired realization of a groundbreaking scientific discovery. It's the kind of story that makes for great teaching material, simple, easy to understand, and visually memorable. It captures the essence of scientific discovery as something that happens in a sudden, almost magical moment. In reality, though, Newton's work on gravity was the result of years of careful study, observation, and mathematical analysis. The true story behind Newton's discovery of gravity is much less sensational, but no less significant. His groundbreaking work, including the development of his laws of motion and universal gravitation, came from a process of meticulous thinking, building upon the work of earlier scientists and philosophers. His insights were revolutionary not because of a sudden moment of inspiration, but because of his deep intellectual rigor and ability to synthesize existing knowledge in a new way. The myth of the apple serves as a reminder that sometimes the way we tell history is shaped more by storytelling conventions than by the actual events. A neat, compelling narrative is often more palatable than the messy, complex reality. And while the apple story may not be true, it's certainly stuck in the public imagination. Another example of how myths can evolve to shape the legacy of historical figures. Now that we've explored how myths can distort even the greatest scientific breakthroughs, let's move on to one of history's most notorious torture devices, the Iron Maiden. Often depicted in films and horror stories, this device is thought to have been used in medieval torture chambers. But in reality, It's another example of a fabricated myth that's been distorted by history. The Iron Maiden, a terrifying, human-shaped sarcophagus with sharp spikes inside, designed to slowly impale a victim, has become the quintessential symbol of medieval cruelty and barbarism. This image has been seared into our collective consciousness through horror films, metal album covers, and the darkest corners of history. It's often depicted as one of the most horrific devices in the history of torture, used by the sadistic rulers and tyrants of the Middle Ages. But here's the shocking truth. The Iron Maiden likely never existed as a torture device at all. The Iron Maiden, as we know it, was actually invented in the 18th century, centuries after the medieval period. The device, which is thought to have been used to slowly kill its victims by piercing their bodies with spikes, was likely fabricated during the Age of Enlightenment as a gruesome spectacle to shock and entertain visitors in European museums. The most famous example of the Iron Maiden is the one displayed in Nuremberg, Germany. But even this version was likely created during the 1700s, long after the Middle Ages had ended. Historically, there's no evidence that the Iron Maiden was ever used as a torture device. While there were certainly cruel and violent methods of torture used during the Middle Ages, such as the breaking wheel, the rack, and burning at the stake, the Iron Maiden is not among them. The device was a creation of sensationalist art, designed to provoke horror and fascination. It was more of a macabre curiosity, a prop in the story of human suffering, rather than a real instrument of torture. The invention of the Iron Maiden is a perfect example of how myths can arise around historical artifacts. Over time, as the Middle Ages became synonymous with brutality and ignorance, people began to imagine devices like the Iron Maiden as part of the period's medieval madness. The device, invented much later, became part of a narrative that painted the medieval period as a time of extreme cruelty and barbarism. The story of the Iron Maiden is an exaggerated symbol, created to fit into a larger myth about the Dark Ages, a time when people, allegedly, thought nothing of using the most grotesque and horrifying methods to extract confessions or punish enemies. What's particularly interesting about the Iron Maiden myth is how it taps into our fascination with human cruelty and suffering. It's easier to believe in something so extreme and dramatic because it fits into our preconceived notions about history. The idea of a medieval torture device serves as a vivid symbol of everything we think we know about the past, but the truth is far less sensational. The Iron Maiden was never part of the grim reality of medieval torture. It was merely a creation of the 18th century, designed to shock, entertain, and ultimately perpetuate a myth about the past. With the Iron Maiden myth debunked, let's move on to another example of how historical myths can be crafted around seemingly simple things: the origins of baseball. Many people believe that Abner Doubleday, a heroic Civil War general, invented the game in Cooperstown, New York. But like so many stories in history, the real truth is far more complicated and far less romantic. The story of Abner Doubleday inventing baseball in Cooperstown, New York, is one of the most enduring myths in American sports history. It's a quintessential American origin story, full of patriotism and nostalgia, a tale of a man who created a beloved national pastime in the quaint fields of rural New York. The myth has been so deeply ingrained in American culture that it's hard to imagine baseball's origins without thinking of Doubleday. However, the truth is that this widely accepted narrative is entirely fabricated. The myth of Doubleday inventing baseball was created in 1907 by a special commission formed by the Mills Commission, which was tasked with determining the true origins of the game. The commission, looking for an American-born inventor to elevate the national pride surrounding baseball, latched onto Doubleday's name, which had become associated with the game due to a mix-up in records. There was no evidence that Doubleday invented baseball, nor did he ever claim to have done so. In fact, his own writings show that he was preoccupied with military matters during his life, particularly his service in the Civil War. His diaries contain no mention of baseball, much less its invention. So, if Doubleday didn't invent baseball, then who did? The truth is, the origins of baseball are much more complicated and lie in a mix of English and American traditions. Baseball evolved from older bat-and ball games played in Europe, most notably in Britain. Games like rounders and cricket were played long before Doubleday's time, and it's from these games that modern baseball emerged. By the 19th century, baseball was already being played in various forms across the United States, with no single person or event responsible for its creation. The myth of Doubleday was created not to preserve the truth, but to create a simple, unifying narrative. It was a way to claim the invention of baseball as a uniquely American achievement, free from European influence. The story also helped promote the idea of baseball as a national pastime, one that was not only a part of American culture, but its very foundation. The reality of baseball's origins, however, is far more nuanced. It's a product of cultural exchange and evolution, shaped by various games and rules over time. The creation of the Doubleday myth reveals the power of cultural narratives. When a story is compelling enough, it can shape public perception, even when the facts don't align with the narrative. The myth persists because it gives people a simple and satisfying answer to a complex question. It's a reminder that history, like baseball itself, is shaped not only by the past, but by how we choose to remember it. As we move from America's favorite pastime to an iconic dish, let's take a look at General Tso's chicken, a dish that is supposedly a staple of Chinese cuisine, named after a military hero. The truth, however, is just as surprising as the myths surrounding baseball and the Iron Maiden. General Tso's chicken, the sweet and spicy deep-fried staple of Chinese takeout menus across the United States, is a dish that many people believe originates from China, specifically named after a famous 19th century military leader. The dish, often served with crispy chicken pieces coated in a glossy, sticky sauce, has become an iconic symbol of Chinese-American cuisine. However, the truth is that General Tso's chicken is about as authentically Chinese as a cheeseburger. The dish was actually invented in the 1970s by Chef Peng Changhui, a Chinese chef who had moved to the United States. Peng, originally from Hunan province in China, created the dish as a way to introduce American diners to the flavors of his homeland. The name General Tso was chosen as a nod to a historical figure, Zhuo Zongtang, a military leader who played a significant role in the Qing dynasty during the 19th century. However, There's no historical evidence to suggest that General Tso ever had any connection to the dish or its ingredients. In fact, the dish as we know it today bears little resemblance to any traditional Hainanese or Chinese dish from the time of Zhuozongtang. The popularity of General Tso's chicken in Chinese-American cuisine was largely a product of the 1970s restaurant boom. As Chinese food became increasingly popular in the U.S., chefs began to adapt traditional Chinese ingredients and cooking methods to suit the American palate. General Tso's chicken was one of these adaptations. Its sweet, tangy sauce and deep-fried crispy texture were designed to appeal to American tastes, which were more accustomed to fried, hearty dishes than to the subtler flavors found in traditional Chinese cooking. Interestingly, the dish's name was not only an invention of Chef Peng, but also a product of the growing trend in American Chinese restaurants to name dishes after famous Chinese figures or military leaders, giving them an air of authenticity and tradition. The dish took off in popularity and became so synonymous with Chinese-American cuisine that it was widely believed to be an ancient recipe passed down through generations. The truth, however, is that General Tso's chicken is a product of modern culinary innovation, a fusion of Chinese ingredients with American tastes, born out of necessity and adaptation, rather than historical tradition. This culinary myth illustrates how stories and names can become attached to dishes over time, even when those associations are purely fictional. Just as with the legends of General Tso and the false narrative of baseball's origins, food stories can take on a life of their own. They shape our understanding of a culture, even when they don't accurately reflect the reality. Next, we'll examine one of the most famous tricks in military history, the Trojan horse, a story of cunning and deception that has become one of the most well-known tales of the ancient world. But, as with many myths, the truth behind the story might be even stranger than fiction. The story of the Trojan horse is one of the most enduring legends from ancient history. It's a tale of Greeks who, unable to breach the walls of Troy, craft a giant wooden horse, hide soldiers inside, and present it as a gift to the Trojans. The Trojans, thinking it's a symbol of peace, bring the horse inside their city, only to have it open up at night and unleash Greek soldiers who sack the city. The Trojan horse has come to symbolize a brilliant military trick, a masterstroke of cunning and deception, where the Greeks outwit the Trojans by using the element of surprise. However, historians have long questioned whether this story is a literal account of a military event or a metaphor used by ancient poets to describe a siege. Most historians now believe that the Trojan horse was likely a symbolic representation of the siege itself, rather than a literal horse that the Greeks used to infiltrate Troy. The earliest accounts of the Trojan War, particularly those from the Aeneid by Virgil, present the horse as a metaphorical tool, a device in the story to represent the final defeat of Troy. In fact, the idea of the Trojan horse as a literal object may have been a later embellishment. Most likely, it was a poetic description of the Greeks using a siege engine, such as a battering ram or a large wooden structure, to break through the walls of Troy. The horse itself could have been a symbolic representation of the final attack, or even a clever way of describing a tactic that the Greeks used to surprise the Trojans. Some theories suggest that the horse could even refer to the Greeks' use of psychological warfare, tricking the Trojans into thinking they were abandoning the siege and leaving behind a gift, only to return when they were most vulnerable. While the precise historical details of the Trojan War remain unclear, what is undeniable is the power of storytelling. The myth of the Trojan horse, while likely not a literal account of military strategy, has captured the imagination of generations. It's a classic example of how myths and stories can evolve over time, becoming so ingrained in cultural memory that they overshadow the reality of what might have happened. The Trojan horse may never have existed as a physical object, but as a symbol, it remains one of the most powerful stories of deception and clever strategy in the history of warfare. The myth of the Trojan horse serves as a reminder of how ancient myths can evolve and take on new meanings over time, depending on how they are interpreted. What began as a poetic device became an enduring legend that has shaped our understanding of ancient warfare. But just as with so many other myths, the story has been altered and exaggerated over time, shifting the focus from the military strategies of the Greeks to the dramatic and deceptive image of a giant wooden horse. Now, let's move on to another historical myth that has been distorted over time: the story of the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. While this tale is often portrayed as a heroic stand of 300 warriors against a massive Persian army, the full story is far more complex and involves far more than just the Spartans. The Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartan warriors famously held off a Persian army of tens of thousands, is one of the most celebrated tales of military bravery and sacrifice in history. The story has become a symbol of heroism, honor, and defiance, encapsulated by the image of King Leonidas and his warriors standing firm against overwhelming odds. But while the story is undeniably powerful, it's also a simplification of a far more complex historical reality. The popular narrative, perpetuated by movies, books, and even modern pop culture, centers on the 300 Spartans as the lone heroes standing against a vast Persian empire. The myth of the 300 paints a picture of a small band of warriors making an ultimate sacrifice in a hopeless fight, an underdog story that resonates deeply with ideas of courage and resistance. However, this story overlooks the larger context of the battle. While the Spartans were indeed at the heart of the defense, they were not alone. In reality, they were part of a much larger Greek alliance, consisting of around 7,000 soldiers from various city-states, including Thespians, Thebans, and others. These forces came together to resist the Persian invasion, and it wasn't just the 300 Spartans who fought at Thermopylae. While the Spartans were the elite warriors, they were supported by a sizable force, all of whom were engaged in the defense of Greece. The focus on the 300 Spartans has been, in part, a later simplification of the true scope of the battle. The reason the Spartans are emphasized so heavily is due to their military prowess and their symbolic role in the narrative of Western civilization. The Spartans were seen as the embodiment of the warrior ethos, their discipline and courage often highlighted as the core values of the Greek resistance. This focus on the Spartans also served to elevate the myth of Thermopylae, reducing the larger Greek alliance to a mere backdrop for the Spartan heroism. Moreover, The way the story is told tends to overlook the fact that the Spartans ultimately retreated after their position was betrayed by a Greek traitor, Ephialtes, who revealed a mountain pass that allowed the Persians to outflank the Greek forces. The decision for the 300 Spartans to stay behind and fight to the death was a calculated one, rooted in Spartan culture and military tradition. They weren't simply being heroic for the sake of heroism. They were following a code that emphasized honor in battle, even if it meant their own demise. The myth of the 300 has become a powerful symbol of sacrifice, but it's also a distorted version of the true history. The larger Greek effort was a collective one, and it's important to recognize that the Battle of Thermopylae was not just about a handful of warriors making a stand. It was about the unity of multiple city-states coming together to resist an invading empire. The 300 Spartans, though incredibly brave, were not the only ones fighting for Greece's survival. This myth is a reflection of how history, especially military history, is often simplified and mythologized. It's easier to tell a compelling story about a small group of heroes than to explain the intricacies of a multifaceted military engagement. But as with so many myths, the truth is more complex, and the real story of Thermopylae deserves to be remembered in its full context. With the myth of the 300 Spartans debunked, let's now move on to another cultural phenomenon, the Mozart effect. This theory, which suggested that listening to Mozart's music could make you smarter, swept the world in the 1990s. But like many fads, the reality behind it was far more complicated and less impactful than the myth that was created. In the 1990s, the world was introduced to the Mozart effect, a theory that claimed listening to Mozart's music could improve your brain power and make you smarter. Parents flocked to buy Mozart CDs for their babies, hoping to enhance their children's intelligence, while researchers and educators debated the validity of the claims. The idea became so widespread that it seemed almost self-evident. If you want to make your child a genius, simply play them some Mozart. But here's the truth. The Mozart effect, as it was widely understood, was based on a misinterpretation of a small and very specific study conducted in 1993. The original research, led by Alfred A. Tomatis, involved a group of college students who were tested on their spatial reasoning skills after listening to Mozart's sonata for 2 years. The study found a slight, short-term improvement in their spatial reasoning abilities immediately after listening to Mozart, but the effect was temporary, lasting only about 10 to 15 minutes. It was a small, focused experiment, and the results were inconclusive when it came to making any broader claims about cognitive development or intelligence. Despite this, the media seized on the study and spun it into a global phenomenon. The concept of Mozart makes you smarter spread rapidly, far beyond the scope of the original study, with many claiming that listening to Mozart's music would somehow enhance your IQ, improve your memory, and increase your brain power over time. This myth became entrenched in popular culture, and before long, Mozart was marketed as the key to unlocking your child's genius potential. Schools, parents, and even some daycare centers adopted the idea, using Mozart as a tool for early childhood development. However, further research into the Mozart effect revealed that the original study's findings were largely overstated. Subsequent studies showed no significant long-term benefits from listening to Mozart's music, and no evidence that it had any lasting impact on intelligence. The Mozart effect was, in reality, a very narrow and specific phenomenon that was distorted by media and public interpretation into a broad, misleading claim about cognitive development. This myth serves as a cautionary tale about the power of media and public perception. It shows how a small piece of scientific data can be blown out of proportion, leading to widespread misconceptions. The Mozart effect wasn't the discovery of a magic bullet for boosting brain power. It was simply a fleeting observation that became inflated by hype and sensationalism. The true lesson here is that intellectual development is far more complex than a piece of music, and that myths, no matter how catchy, can sometimes cloud the real science behind them. Having dispelled the Mozart effect, let's now look at another fascinating historical myth, the legend of the perpetual motion machine. In the early 1800s, an inventor named Charles Red Heifer claimed to have created a machine that could run forever without any external power source. It was hailed as a miracle, a device that defied the laws of physics. But like so many myths in history, the truth behind Heifer's invention is far more mundane and much less miraculous. In the early 1800s, Charles Red Heifer, an inventor from the United States, presented a machine that he claimed could operate indefinitely without an external power source, essentially a perpetual motion machine. This device, a complex arrangement of gears and weights, was touted as a revolutionary invention that defied the laws of physics. Heifer charged people $1 to see his machine in action, and crowds lined up, eager to witness what they thought would be a breakthrough of unprecedented importance. However, the machine was nothing more than an elaborate hoax. When skeptics investigated, they discovered that the perpetual motion machine wasn't actually operating on its own at all. Heifer had a hidden assistant who was manually cranking the machine while pretending it was running on its own. In fact, there was no perpetual motion at all, just a well-executed scam designed to exploit people's fascination with the idea of defying the laws of nature. The story of Heifer's invention serves as a reminder of the enduring human fascination with impossible ideas. The concept of perpetual motion, machines that can run forever without energy input, has been an alluring idea for inventors and dreamers for centuries. Yet, it's a concept that violates the very principles of thermodynamics, the laws of physics that govern the behavior of energy and matter. The idea that such a machine could exist has always been scientifically impossible, yet the myth persists because it taps into a desire for miraculous, boundary-defying inventions. Heifer's scam was eventually exposed, but not before he had convinced many people that his machine was real. The fact that he could charge people to see a fake invention demonstrates the power of a well-told story and the human tendency to believe in the impossible, especially when it promises to revolutionize the way we understand the world. While the myth of the perpetual motion machine was debunked, it highlights how easily people can be swayed by a seemingly magical solution, no matter how implausible it might seem. This myth, like many others, is rooted in a blend of curiosity, hope, and the desire to believe in breakthroughs that promise to change the world. Heifer's machine may not have been a real scientific achievement, but it captured the imagination of many and became another example of how easily myths can be constructed around seemingly impossible ideas. With the truth about perpetual motion now exposed, let's turn our attention to a fascinating piece of art history: the belief that ancient Greek and Roman statues were once pristine white marble. For centuries, this was the dominant view of classical art, but as we'll discover, it's a myth that's been thoroughly debunked. When we think of ancient Greek and Roman art, what comes to mind? Elegant, pristine white marble statues of gods, heroes, and philosophers, symbolizing purity, timelessness, and beauty. The image of white marble sculptures has been ingrained in Western cultural memory for centuries, shaping our understanding of classical antiquity. However, the truth behind these statues is much more colorful than we've been led to believe. In reality, most ancient Greek and Roman statues were originally painted in vivid, sometimes even garish colors. Far from being the simple, monochromatic works of art we see today, these statues were once coated in bright reds, blues, greens, and yellows, with painted irises and eyebrows, and sometimes even gold or bronze accessories. The stark white marble we associate with classical art today is actually the result of centuries of wear and weathering, which caused the paint to fade and wear away. This misconception about the pristine white marble statues originated during the Renaissance, when artists rediscovered classical sculptures. At that time, they assumed that the white marble represented the ideal aesthetic of ancient art, associating it with simplicity, balance, and harmony. But it wasn't until the late 20th century, with the advent of new techniques in art conservation and analysis, that researchers discovered the vibrant pigments still visible on fragments of ancient statues. The shift in our understanding of ancient art reveals an important lesson about how cultural narratives are shaped. The idea of white marble statues reflects the values and aesthetics of the Renaissance period, not the actual appearance of the statues in their original context. By stripping away the paint, we inadvertently stripped away part of the cultural context and meaning behind the artwork. The colorful statues were not simply ornamental. The colors were a crucial part of how ancient cultures expressed identity, status, and power. The use of color was not just aesthetic, it had symbolic and cultural significance. The myth of the pristine white marble statues is a perfect example of how history can be misinterpreted and altered over time. It's a reminder that our understanding of the past is often influenced by our own cultural preferences, values, and assumptions. Just as the ancient Greeks and Romans used color to enhance their art, we've used the idea of white marble to shape our vision of the classical world. Now that we've uncovered the truth behind ancient statues, let's move on to another popular myth: the legend of the American Wild West, where gunfights and lawless cowboys roamed free. This iconic image has been shaped by Hollywood and dime novels, but the real Wild West was much more orderly and far less glamorous than the movies would have us believe. When we think of the American Wild West, we imagine dusty streets, rugged cowboys, and quick-draw duels at high noon. The iconic image of two gunslingers facing off in the middle of a deserted street, tumbleweed blowing past, is the epitome of Hollywood's portrayal of frontier life. It's an image of constant danger, lawlessness, and quick, violent justice. But the reality of the Wild West was far less dramatic and far more structured than the movies and books would have us believe. In reality, organized shootouts were incredibly rare. Most frontier towns, contrary to the popular image, actually had fairly strict gun control laws. It was common for visitors to be required to check their firearms at the sheriff's office when entering town, and many towns had ordinances prohibiting the open carry of weapons. The idea of a wild, lawless land where gunfights broke out on every corner is largely a myth perpetuated by dime novels, Hollywood films, and later television shows. Most violent deaths in the Old West occurred not in dramatic, one-on-one shootouts, but in drunken brawls, bar fights, or disputes over property. While the famous gunfighters like Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, and Doc Holliday certainly became legends, their lives were far more complex than the romanticized versions we see in films. Many of the wild cowboys of the West were actually lawmen, ranchers, and traders who were simply doing business in a region that was still in the process of being settled and organized. This myth of constant gunfights and lawlessness was cultivated and spread by sensationalist novels and plays in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Writers like Zane Grey and Louis L. Amer romanticized the frontier, creating larger-than-life characters and dramatic situations that made for exciting reading, but had little basis in reality. Hollywood, in turn, took these exaggerated tales and turned them into action-packed blockbusters, cementing the image of the Wild West in the public imagination as a place of constant violence and chaos. The truth is that the Wild West was a region in transition, a place where communities were being built and law and order were slowly being established. It was a time of change, conflict, and struggle, but it was also a time of cooperation, compromise, and adaptation. The myth of the Wild West as a place of unrestrained violence oversimplifies the reality of frontier life, where people were working to build a society, even in the face of hardship and danger. The Wild West myth reveals how powerful storytelling can be in shaping our perception of history. The exaggerated image of quick-draw duels and lawless cowboys serves as a compelling narrative, but it's far from the reality of what life was truly like on the American frontier. Now, let's explore another myth about the cultural landscape of the Old West: the notion that the cowboy was a figure defined by a single racial identity. The truth is far more diverse and complex. When we picture a cowboy, it's easy to imagine a rugged white man in a wide-brimmed hat, riding across the dusty plains of the American West. This image is a classic representation of the cowboy, largely popularized by Hollywood films and Western novels. But the reality of the cowboy's identity is far more diverse than this singular image suggests. In truth, cowboys came from all walks of life, and a significant portion of them were African American, Mexican, and Native American. The image of the cowboy as a predominantly white figure is a product of cultural erasure and historical simplification. Many people are unaware that up to 25% of all cowboys in the late 19th century were African American, many of whom were former slaves who found work as cowhands, wranglers, and ranch hands on cattle drives. These African American cowboys were essential to the development of the cattle industry and played a crucial role in shaping the American West. Their contributions, however, have often been overlooked or downplayed in mainstream depictions of Western history. Mexican cowboys, or vaqueros, were another key influence on the cowboy tradition. The vaquero culture was brought to the American Southwest by Spanish settlers in the 16th century, long before the establishment of the United States. The vaquero system of cattle herding, with its distinctive riding techniques, clothing, and equipment, such as the lasso and the spurs, heavily influenced the development of the American cowboy. In fact, much of the cowboys' gear and practices originated from Mexican vaqueros, and many of the terms associated with cowboy culture, like rodeo and lariat, have Spanish roots. Native American cowboys also existed, particularly among the Plains tribes, who had long traditions of horsemanship and cattle herding. Native Americans, such as the Comanche and Apache, had been skilled horse riders for centuries, and many were hired as cowboys by ranchers to help manage cattle. Despite the romanticized image of the cowboy as a lone, rugged figure, the reality was that the cowboy culture was shaped by multiple ethnic groups, each contributing their own unique skills and traditions. The myth of the cowboy as a singularly white, solitary figure erases the rich diversity that existed in the American West. It reflects a broader tendency in American history to simplify and homogenize complex cultural identities. The cowboy as a figure is not defined by race or ethnicity, but by the skills, work ethic, and perseverance required to survive and thrive in the harsh conditions of the frontier. By recognizing the multicultural roots of cowboy culture, we gain a more nuanced and accurate understanding of the American West. The cowboy wasn't just one person. He was a product of a variety of cultures, and his legacy is shaped by the diverse people who helped build the American frontier. With that myth debunked, let's explore one final piece of history: the famous story of Rome burning while Emperor Nero allegedly played his fiddle. This dramatic image has been immortalized in art, literature, and popular culture, but the truth behind the myth is far more complex and much less sensational. The legend of Emperor Nero playing his fiddle while Rome burned is one of the most enduring and dramatic myths in history. It paints a picture of a detached, callous ruler, indifferent to the suffering of his people, as he serenely strummed his instrument while his city was engulfed in flames. It's an image so vivid and morally charged that it has endured for centuries, becoming synonymous with tyranny, decadence, and cruelty. But the truth behind this story is far more complicated, and the fiddling itself is a complete fabrication. The Great Fire of Rome occurred in 64 AD during Nero's reign, and it devastated much of the city. Historical accounts suggest that the fire lasted for several days and left vast portions of the city in ruins. According to the myth, while the city burned, Nero stood on his palace balcony, playing his fiddle and watching the flames, a symbol of his utter disregard for the lives of his people. However, the fiddle, or lyra in Roman terms, didn't even exist in Nero's time. The fiddle, as we know it today, wouldn't be invented for centuries. Nero, in fact, would have played a lyre or another stringed instrument, but there is no record of him doing so during the fire. The true story is much more complex. The ancient historian Tacitus, one of the most reliable sources on Nero's reign, states that Nero was actually not in Rome when the fire began. He was at his villa in Antium, about 35 miles away. Upon hearing of the fire, he rushed back to the city and organized relief efforts, providing food, shelter, and even money for the homeless. Nero also opened public buildings for the displaced and allowed them to shelter there. The myth of Nero playing his fiddle likely emerged after the fire as part of a smear campaign. Nero was already a controversial figure, especially due to his lavish spending on personal luxuries and his authoritarian rule. After the fire, he used the space cleared by the destruction to build his extravagant palace, the Domus Aurea, which included vast gardens and enormous halls. This project, in the eyes of many Romans, symbolized Nero's greed and indifference to the suffering of his people, and it didn't help that some of the displaced citizens were forced to live in makeshift camps as the emperor indulged in his opulence. The story of Nero playing music while Rome burned was likely a piece of political propaganda spread by his enemies, especially after his reign ended. Nero's reign was followed by a period of instability, and his enemies, many of whom were influential senators, used stories like this one to paint him as a tyrant. In reality, there's no evidence to support the claim that Nero played the lyre during the fire, or that he was as indifferent as the myth suggests. Instead, the myth was a product of later political agendas and the desire to cast Nero as the epitome of imperial excess. The Nero fiddle myth is a perfect example of how history can be manipulated for political purposes, especially after a ruler's fall from power. Just as the story of Nero's musical indifference to the fire became an enduring symbol of cruelty, it also shows how easily we can be swept up by dramatic tales that fit our moral narratives. The truth is more nuanced, involving not just an emperor's actions, but the political landscape that shaped the way his legacy was viewed. As we conclude our journey through some of the most famous historical myths, we've uncovered the ways in which myths, legends, and stories shape our understanding of the past. Whether it's the Great Wall of China, the sewer alligators of New York City, or the colorful statues of ancient Greece, these myths persist because they tap into deeper themes of human curiosity, fear, and imagination. They may not always be grounded in fact, but they reveal much about the cultures that create them and the power of storytelling to shape our collective memory.